Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Older Shoulder Masterclass. This is part 4. We will be talking all about treatment and working through building on our assessment and working through what are some of the strategies we can use to address some of the impairments we've found in our assessment.
Perfect. Well, I'm looking forward to getting going with it too. If we look at this older shoulder in terms of rehab, one of the things I'm going to come back to at the end is the importance of setting realistic expectations, because I've already given some clues as we've gone along. Is you've got to know the ingredients you're dealing with to know how far you're going to be able to take that patient. However, if we look at the key principles of any patient we see with MSK pain, the key thing is listening to their story first of all. And if you look at what really matters to patients, empathy is top of the list. And that's about just listening, hearing their story, reflecting back the important things and showing that you've heard them. And I could talk for hours about communication, but I'm conscious I want to get onto the specifics of what I do treatment-wise. It's also obviously important to elicit their expectations, because we know patients often are quite unrealistic about timescales for recovery. But a big thing that I really want to share with you in terms of my underlying principle to treatment is empowering our patients. So yes, of course, we can do that in terms of our education, but we can do that through our movement too. Now, we talked earlier about the importance of investing in the individual and shining a light on all those things that can potentially influence recovery. And again, part of that education and being honest with patients is all about how we make life easier for that shoulder in a way that essentially gives them a break, if you like, in that pain experience and allows them to get on that road to success. So if I'm looking at approaching somebody, assuming I've got all my communication right, I've listened to that patient, they know that I'm absolutely in their circle, I understand their why and where they want to get back to, the specifics of what I do follow some really simple principles. So the first thing is I'm going to unload that shoulder. I want to find a place that if I unload it, that actually they can move better with less pain and importantly with more confidence. Now there's lots of different ways I can do that. I can physically unload the arm by supporting it on a table, on a ball, on the wall. I can change the lever arm, as you saw with that assessment, but also I can use the kinetic chain. So if I initiate my movement with the kinetic chain, we have lovely evidence showing us that essentially it overrides some of the compensatory strategies, but also gives us better recruitment of those local muscles. But you can also understand that if I reassure a patient about what's causing their pain and validate that pain experience, that in itself unloads them just by modulating some of those descending influences. Now, I guess for me, symptom modification is all about that patient experience of movement that changes their belief that something is wrong, but also importantly puts them in the driving seat. So I'm doing something that changes how it feels to move, but then giving them an exercise that replicates that at home. So if you think about what we've seen so far, so you remember Will, that we went through his symptom modification, and actually with Will, what I found is that if I got him to do a short lever through range with some resistance, that was the thing that made it feel better, but it was quite hard to do. Whereas when we got him to do that step forward, that was the thing that made it feel nice and easier. He'd just done a bit too much in the gym, very kind of my son to injure himself. But it was a really nice way of just showing that just that unloading, a little bit of resistance and the kinetic chain made the difference. Now, the important thing is that the patient sees that it's meaningful to them, because we know that's a massive thing in terms of adherence and them getting the maximum benefit. So he does this step forwards with the through range resistance. So if we then look at the next video, then we just do an exercise based on that. Now, you can see Will, as he's doing this exercise, is looking very serious. Obviously, it's because he's my son and he's fed up of being filmed. But if this was a patient, that's telling me that they've not engaged. And you'll see there's a point at which he smiles. And I think I said something to the effect of, imagine it's Man United lifting the cup. It's never going to happen, but you can imagine it, because he's a Man United supporter. I'm a Liverpool supporter. An interesting combination in the same house. But you see the change in his demeanour in that laugh. So again, I'm always looking to the patient, because if they were really looking at me like Will is, I haven't got them. Essentially, they're not engaging with me. I want them to feel the benefit and it to look like it's kind of making sense to them. Now, you'll remember my other lady, this final video that we saw where I did the scapular assistance test. And essentially, how do I then make that into an exercise for her? Because obviously she can't take me home. Then I just need something that gives her that same physical effect. Now, not everybody's got a gym ball. This lady did have a gym ball at home. That makes it easy, but she could do exactly the same exercise just with her back against the wall. So now what you'll see she does, and this is great because I've got that lower quadrant, a bit of a squat at the same time as she's doing her through range recruitment. So I'm mimicking that resistance because I still want the cuff and scapula working together, but importantly, she gets that sensory input from the ball at the back. She was laughing there because she was so delighted she'd finally found a use for this ball that she'd just had been thinking she needed to get rid of.
Is she loving you or hating you in that exercise?
She's loving me. She's loving me because she kind of went, oh yeah, that feels really good. I really like this. And again, you've got a winner there. If the patient likes it and it feels good, it's going to work for them. But there's lots of different ways I could affect the same thing. I could just have band around her back and get her to do a step forward. I could just, again, do it against the wall. It doesn't have to use the ball. But fundamentally, they all achieve the same thing. They replicate the symptom modification that improved her symptoms.
But you're not worried that you're impinging her or creating, like you would know instantly if you're exaggerating their pain or flaring their pain to avoid an exercise, and you use that to guide whether that's...
Yeah, and I love that because we have this whole pain or no pain debate. If she gets an ache at the back of her shoulder because she's woken her posterior cuff up, I'm absolutely delighted because it's working harder. I don't want her sharp pain because my rationale is I'm just making load transfer, whatever we want to use as a basis for our understanding. So, but what I love about your question is, let's say that she said that was hurting. I'd just get her to squeeze her hands a little bit harder or go a bit faster or do something to just make it more sensory rich and have more of an unloading effect, rather than my old life as a junior physio, I'd have made things easier and more isolated. But when you look at the shoulder, it's an attention monster. It loves input. So actually you make it harder and harder the more isolated you make it. So, that's why I love that question, because often more makes it easier for the patient to get the best effect from the exercise.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and something that, in my very limited experience as a clinician treating shoulders many years ago, would never have thought about.
Well, believe me, it's taken a lot of years for me to get there, that's for sure. Now, back to if we go on to the next slide, if you think about those patients you were talking to me about where essentially they're really reluctant, they don't want you to touch them, etc., we can just look at other ways that we can unload them. So you can see Jack here sat at a table, so I don't have to be touching him at all. I can get him to do a table slide where you can see I can't help myself with that little bit of yellow TheraBand, to just because the posterior cuff is where the evidence suggests most patients have an issue. He's getting exactly the same effect, but I'm unloading it and he can assist with the other arm. So exactly the same principles, but he's somebody that, let's say, I couldn't change his pain. And so I've just made it so easy that essentially I've taken all the threat away and he can initiate that movement leaning forward with his trunk. Second video, let's say we have patients who just will not take their hands away from their body. So then what I can do is get the body to go around the arm. Now, weight bearing is something that's getting some interest in osteoarthritis, as we know, but again, has a great pedigree in any shoulder pathology, because that weight bearing is a great way of just getting that initial upregulation of the rotator cuff. So I've got weight bearing, I've got that resistance to the posterior cuff, but then I move the body away from the arm. It's just really a question of how much do I have to support it, how dynamic do I have to make it to find a way in for that patient that's struggling. And the final video is another similar thing, which is just literally supported on the wall, and again using the kinetic chain to initiate with a step. So you can see how easy it is to apply those really simple principles in lots of different situations. Now, I've mentioned the kinetic chain a couple of times, and I think it's important just to summarize. I was involved in a systematic review as part of somebody's master's, where basically they looked at all the evidence about exercises that were shoulder exercises but initiated with the kinetic chain. So if you look at the top video here, which is essentially Ellie just doing a step forwards and again external resistance against the wall, studies showed very clearly that if you initiate your exercises with a step up, or some form of weight transfer, you get a consistent effect on getting better local recruitment of the cuff and scapular muscles and have a relative unloading effect because you take away those protective strategies. And interestingly, thoracic rotation, as you can see in the second video, does exactly the same thing. So some very simple principles that we can use to add to that unloading effect. Now, if you look at how, again, in that irritable population, so you can see here, Jack at the top is doing bridge with his shoulder flexion through range. So very much that same short lever elevation, but initiating it with a bridge. You can see I've got this little lady here in the second video who essentially is going to then do exactly the same thing with a bridge. Now this lady couldn't lift her arm up, as you'll see in a moment, and just adding the bridge in, she was able to get about 100 degrees of elevation. But I can do exactly the same with thoracic rotation as Jack's doing here. All I'm really thinking in my head is how can I exaggerate the kinetic chain to make life easier for the shoulder? And honestly, if you play around with this in the clinic, if you've got somebody post-op or with a really irritable shoulder, even if you just get them to punch up to the ceiling, initiating it with that bridge is very, very powerful. Now, my lady that I told you about before, we can also use this just to change how they're moving at home. So with this lady, you'll see she's got loads of pain on that left shoulder. And so all I get her to do is one, just change that lever arm. So lead with her hand rather than that Dalek type, lift your arm up straight, which nobody does functionally anyway, but then initiate it with a step. So what you'll see now is she just steps forward and comes back and she doesn't get that horrible pain. So it's just, again, if you think of the kinetic chain as a way of unloading the shoulder, but actually also potentially making it more sensory rich, there's no doubt it could be distracting the patient as well. But honestly, if you just always think, initiate with the lower quadrant or use your thoracic rotation or add both, it's a really nice, simple way of unloading and challenging some of those protective strategies. So hopefully that gives you some nice examples. So the other thing I always think about, and you'll notice you've seen that loop of yellow TheraBand all the way through, is that I'm just trying to give that system some input to just get the muscle system working more effectively, differently. People in pain move differently. And as I said, the common theme seems to be that posterior cuff. But whether I use that loop of TheraBand for some resistance, the weight bearing for that kind of very proprioceptive closed kinetic chain effect, or I just give them some auditory or visual clues, all these things can just augment the effects of our exercises. Now you can see there was a common theme with those first few, which was all about through range recruitment, and I'm just limited by how well they do it and how far they can go without pain, and we just improve that as we increase their confidence. But the other thing I need to look at is that torque production role of the rotator cuff. Now, the other thing that's really nice is you remember that prone cuff assessment or the supported resisted testing. Again, this is so easy to make into an exercise. I can do it as Will's doing in the first exercise, kneeling next to a table or with my elbow on a ball. Again, I want it to be supported so that I'm really isolating the rotator cuff. If somebody's really irritable, there's no way they'll be able to get their arm up there. But we see from the evidence that as long as you're about 30 degrees or higher, so we get a bit of capsular tension, we have a very similar effect on isolating that cuff. So you can see Jack on the right here in this video. Essentially, we just start, and when he can do 20 without any without any load, then we can just start to add some load in. Now, Karen Jin would suggest increasing this up to 2 kilos. Depending on the patient, I quite like to aim for around 5% of body weight because that's generally the weight of the arm. There's no good science for that. And if I'm honest, what you'll find is because you're getting them moving in a different way, often this actually improves very, very quickly because it's less about strength. It's more about recruitment and just giving them that foundation to use their muscle system more effectively. But again, 2 really simple exercises based on our improvement test and on assessing that torque production. So really nice things. Now, of course, in terms of the bigger picture, in terms of strength, you'll remember what I talked about in terms of the importance of lower limb strength and power. So, of course, that's something that I want to build in, but it's always on the basis of those foundations that we've talked about. To me, it's always about what that patient wants to get back to. Now, I always remember a little patient, Ethel, who used to do crown green bowls and she wasn't able to do it. She had a fall, she fractured her shoulder, she lived on her own, she got very depressed because she couldn't see her friends. We had a talk about the other things she liked doing, and she liked baking cakes. So I kind of said, well, why don't you bake a cake and go and visit them so you still see your friends while you're getting better to get back to your crown green bowls. So that was her socialization. So she got that contact and that made her really happy. And then we worked on a lower quadrant strength alongside her shoulder so that she could get back to her crown green bowls and improve her balance, etc. I don't think the Crown Green Bowls team liked me particularly when she got back, because one, she stopped making cakes, and two, she was playing some pretty mean Crown Green Bowls. But again, it's always signposting the importance of aligning any strengthening goals with what that patient wants to get back to and what matters to them. So whether it's carrying grandchildren, doing their gardening, whatever, my foundations are exactly what I've shared with you. And then whether I do farmers walks or suitcase walks or squats in their chair, the bottom line is it's always that similar premise of let's get that lower quadrant stronger and build that into their shoulder exercises. So a great example would be something like sit to stand from a chair. I can either punch up or I can sit down around my arms, again building in that lower quadrant strength component and then gradually loading it up in a very safe way that's easy to progress. So some very simple ideas.